Hello and welcome to yet another installment of Burnsville High School's Notes Online. Today we're going to be talking about the segregation and discrimination that happened after the Civil War as we move into the turn of the century. And Jim Crow was a set of laws that were passed to try and really set apart social castes and societies in written and unwritten form. So Jim Crow initially was a minstrel dancer who would be a form of entertainment in the late 1800s. And it would be typically a show where people would come to be entertained, and it would be a white person who was covered in black makeup, who was mocking or being stereotypical about how white people saw black people. And at the time, white people saw African Americans as less smart, as just kind of, field hands, those types of things, so they couldn't possibly be capable of intelligent. And again, this is just reflecting the thoughts of the time. And also, it was just something to mock because they had different behaviors as African Americans than your white people did, or that's what they thought. So it generally was just a way. The Jim Crow laws were named that after this minstrel character or this entertainment character, and then things kind of developed from there. So Jim Crow is what became to be known as kind of the colloquial name for these laws that were passed. It was a racial caste system in the South and the border states between 1877, so post-Reconstruction, and the mid-1960s. So a caste system, you might have heard of a caste system in places like India, where they have the untouchables and going all the way up to high class. So it was a similar type of system without necessarily being legal on a nationwide scale. They passed laws in the South that would discriminate against African Americans. And again, this typically happened between 1877 and the 1960s. And it was more than just kind of this idea of laws that were being passed. It became a way of life. Some examples of some Jim Crow laws. A black male could not offer his hand to shake hands with a white male because it implied being socially equal. Obviously, a black male, and this is again part of the law, obviously a black male could not offer his hand or any other part of his body to a white woman because he risked being accused of rape. A next subset of the laws, blacks and whites were not supposed to eat together. If they did eat together, whites were to be served first, and some sort of partition or divide was to be placed between them. The third part of the law is under no circumstance was a black male to offer to light the cigarette of a white female because it implied that you were in an intimate relationship. So, these continue on and on and on. And it basically just set up a way of behaving in the South and in the border states between white people and African Americans. So it was meant to keep African Americans below white people and to show them that they, in fact, were in charge. They were relegated as African Americans to the status of second-class citizens. So it gave kind of a voice to this anti-black racism that was being practiced, in so many different parts of the country. They affected parts of everyday life. So, for example, barbers were affected. No colored barber shall serve as a barber to white girls or women. That was a law in Georgia. In Louisiana, the Board of Trustees shall maintain a separate building on separate grounds for the admission, care, instruction, and support of all blind persons of color or the black race. They're blind. Why does it matter what they see? Why are we treating anybody differently? For burial rights, the officer in charge of a cemetery shall not bury or allow to be buried any colored person upon grounds set apart or used for the burial of white people. That was in Georgia. Education, schools for white children and schools for Negro children shall be conducted separately. Excuse me. That was in Florida. Prisons, the warden shall see that the white convicts shall have separate apartments for both eating and sleeping from the Negro convicts in Mississippi. They're all criminals. It doesn't matter what color their skin is. I mean, some of these were just seen as ways of, again, kind of building a boundary between the two classes of people, but really it just was a way to keep African Americans down. So why was it successful? In many situations, white Christian ministers preached about God supporting racial segregation. I'm not super familiar with the Bible, but I'm pretty sure that there's nothing in there about segregation and treating someone that way because of a skin color. So people were hearing it in church. If your minister says it's okay, then it's probably okay for me to do. Craniologists, phrenologists, and social Darwinists supported the belief that blacks were intellectually and culturally inferior to whites. A craniologist is someone that studies your cranium or your brain. Phrenology wasn't even a science. It was where people would go and feel the shape of people's heads, and as a result of that, make some sort of scientific hypothesis. It was a phony science. It wasn't actually a science. And then social Darwinism, we talked about last unit, the idea of survival of the fittest in the workforce. So, politicians gave speeches on the danger of integration. So they were hearing it from medical doctors and phrenologists who weren't medical doctors. They were hearing it from social Darwinists who were talking about how to be successful in society. They were talking about it at church. They were talking about it as politicians. They were talking about it in the newspaper. It reinforced anti-black stereotypes in the newspaper. So people are getting it from all different directions. And so if everybody's saying that this is the way to do things, then they're going to fall into this trap where they actually believe that that's appropriate. This is the thing that kind of hurts my heart, is that children's books and games portrayed blacks as inferior beings. So lots of different things reflected the improper language that was being used. The term nigger was infused into different children's books and into games. People were using it on a regular basis. It just wasn't appropriate in the way that people were being treated, but it worked because in all different facets of people's lives, they were being bombarded with this idea that it was okay to segregate. All major institutions reflected and supported the oppression of blacks. So it was also supported by violence, real violence and threatened violence. So if you violated any of these quote-unquote laws, you could be punished. They risked their homes, they risked their jobs, they risked their lives. If you went against any of these kind of etiquette rules, if you were walking on the street and an African American met a white person, the African American had to step off the sidewalk and let the white person pass. If you didn't do that, there was the risk that people would come and torch your house and burn it down. And whether or not this happened on a regular basis, it was actually threatened. And so they didn't know if it was going to happen or not, because there were several instances where violence did occur as a result of violation of these black codes. At the same time, blacks had little support or little recourse because the judge was white, the jury was white, the lawyers were white, the whole audience was white. So there was no support for anybody who had tried to bring anyone to justice as a result of this mistreatment. One of the most severe ways of punishing someone was by lynching. They were the worst form of violence. A lynching is where someone would be hung in public for these violations of these laws. They were sadistic, they were murders, they were carried out by mobs. Groups of people would go and drag people from their homes. They would hang them from a tree, cut off their body parts. It just was the most awful, awful situation, one of the worst that our country has seen, and yet it drew a spectator crowd so people could watch what was happening. Between 1882 and 1968, there were 4,370 known lynchings. So these were the ones that were recorded, not to mention all the people that died at the hands of Jim Crow violence that weren't necessarily, written down or recorded in anybody's records. Most people were hanged publicly or shot publicly, and then their bodies would be defiled by those who had committed this murder. And it would happen most often in small and middle-sized towns where African Americans were competitors to white in terms of jobs. So they would have, 25 jobs, and if 5 of them went to African Americans, they could be at risk for lynching or murder because they were taking jobs away from whites.